For those of you who just joined, I'm Sue Ostef with the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women, and I really want to thank you for being part of today's webinar. This is the second in our series of webinars from our new-ish project on ending mass incarceration, centralizing racial justice, and developing alternatives, the role of anti-domestic violence and sexual assault programs. And before we go further, I just want to take a second to thank the Office on Violence Against Women for the support of this webinar and this amazing project. So, as you're probably aware, today's webinar title is up on the screen, Why Opposing Hyper-Incarceration Should Be Central to the Work of the Anti-Domestic Violence Movement. And in an effort to save time, I'm going to do a very brief introduction of Donna. I did a much longer one last year. When we did another version of this. And it's really hard to do a very short one because there really is so much great stuff I want to say about her. So I hope you can read that slide. And there's a longer bio actually posted on Google Drive, which I really encourage you to get because it also includes some links to some of her amazing work. As you can see from her bio, Donna Coker is a professor of law at the University of Miami School of Law, where I understand it's very humid today. In this position, and really throughout her career, she has just done so much interesting and important work, and I'm really thrilled that she's agreed to share some of her wisdom with us today. And I just want to say it's really been an honor to get to work with Donna on this particular project. And this project really probably wouldn't be in existence if it weren't for the huge amount of great ideas and hard work that Donna put into the actual application of the project. Donna, I really can't thank you enough for all you did to make this project happen. So in an effort to honor Donna and her work, I am going to let you all read the bio yourselves so we can have more time with her. And like I said, I really do encourage you to go to that Google Drive. In addition to the links that are in her bio, there's a bunch of really good handouts that I really encourage you to get. Again, if you have any questions, please type your questions in the chat box in the lower left-hand corner. I'll be collecting them, and we'll ask Donna as many as we can at the end, and we'll leave about 15 minutes. So Donna, I'm so glad you're here today, and I really want to thank you for your really important work and for your willingness to share it with us today. And so I'm going to turn it over to you now. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sue, and thank you to the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women and to the OVW office for funding this really important project. And to all of you who are here, I'm really honored. I mean that so sincerely, to be working with Sue Ostef, who has been, I don't know, one of my heroes for a very long time, and really honored to be with all of you today. And I want to do a special shout out to, I think we have somebody from Arkansas, my home state. Yay, go Razorbacks. So I see today's discussion as part of a larger effort to more strongly connect or reconnect the work we do to respond to and end gender violence with other social justice movements, with civil rights and human rights movements. I think now perhaps more than ever it's critical to work in coalition and to see those connections, and I see that as a part of this whole series of webinars. So this piece is based on an article that I co-authored with Ajane McCoy. And really our hope in writing this piece was to offer some support for those of you who are interested or concerned about being more actively involved or in anti-mass incarceration work. What is that telling me? And wanting to think about how to talk to your stakeholders, your board members, your members, about why this is so central to what you do. So that's really the perspective I'm coming from. So I'm going to begin with a brief description of mass incarceration. I think most of us have seen these figures or have some sense of them. I won't spend a lot of time there because I really want to focus on the connections with the work we do. I'll conclude then with a description or a discussion about the phenomenon of this radical increase in the criminal justice control within a larger framework of a national, indeed international, turn to the use of punitive punishing systems to address social problems more generally. I think if you haven't read Beth Richie's book, I would encourage you to do so. Her description of prison nation is very central to my own analysis. So for the last approximately 40 years or more, the U.S. has engaged in an experiment like no other in U.S. history. And I want to underscore that, like no other in U.S. history. We now incarcerate more people than any other country in the world. We have about 2 million people incarcerated and another 5 million under the supervision of the criminal justice system. And then if you add to that the 35,000 or so that are in immigration detention in any one day, the numbers are truly staggering. Now, it wasn't always this way. The U.S. Inmate population has increased sixfold since the 1970s. That increase began in the 70s and then truly mushroomed in the 80s and the 90s. This increase in prison population is not related to increases in criminal offending. Indeed, we've had a 50% decrease in serious crimes. If you look at reported crimes from the FBI reports, if you look at the National Crime Victimization Survey data, that's a 77% decrease from the years 1993 to 2015. As I'm sure most of you know, this increase has not been proportional across the population, but rather has had dramatically disparate effects on African American men and women, with African American men representing nearly 40% of all male prisoners and African American women 25% of female prisoners, despite being about 13% of the population. African American women and men incarcerated at 6 times higher the rate of white men and women. A great deal of the public attention on mass incarceration has focused on the impact on African American men. And indeed, of course, there are many more men incarcerated than there are women in terms of actual numbers. But when you're concerned with the increase, you find that the largest increase in imprisonment has actually been among women, with an 800% increase since the 70s, and the largest percentage of that increase has been with African American women. Some of that, certainly not all of that, is related to the war on drugs and the particular impact that that's had on women. Drug convictions account for about 11% of incarcerated white men, 24% of incarcerated black men, 26% of incarcerated Latino men. But women of color have been hit even harder. Drug convictions account for 23% of incarcerated white women, but compare that to 39% for black women, 44% for Latinas. You'll hear me using the term hyper-incarceration, and I'll use it sometimes. I'll interchange with mass incarceration, but the reason I choose the term hyper-incarceration is because I think it captures something about this phenomenon that mass incarceration may mask. Mass might imply that this large number and this large increase of incarceration is somehow evenly distributed across the population, when nothing could be farther from the truth. Rather, it's a phenomenon that's hyper-focused It has its greatest impacts in communities of color and in poor white communities. It is related to drug enforcement and other enforcement mechanisms that are focused in particular communities. So it has not only a hyper-focused in terms of the demographics, but it has a hyper-focused that's also geographic. And that's going to be an important part of my discussion today, is to recognize the ways in which the ill effects of hyper-incarceration are geographically located, spatially located, and affect particular neighborhoods in disproportionate ways. So I'm going to talk about 4 ways in which hyper-incarceration or mass incarceration are issues for those of us who are working to end gender violence. Those 4 ways are this: the victimization connection, the economic connection, what I term the neighborhood connection, and the trauma connection. So I think it's important to begin by noting that state-perpetrated violence represents a very significant amount of the violence that women face, and yet we very frequently fail to call that violence against women. I'm talking, of course, about police abuse. I'm talking about prison abuse, both physical and sexual, shackling pregnant women when they're giving birth in prison, the use of solitary confinement, the use of torture. I would recommend, if you haven't already, looking at the project that the African American Policy Forum created called Say Her Name, which documents police brutality directed at African American women and also documents the lack of attention that the cases involving women has received. The victimization connection also has to do with the ways in which criminal justice system involvement is a direct result of victimization by abusive partners or parents or guardians. So a significant number of women under criminal justice supervision are there as a direct result of their own victimization. We see this somewhat in the drug offenses, for example, where conspiracy law has been used by prosecutors in incredibly expansive ways to pull in people who have very, very minor roles in drug offenses and to hold them responsible at a very high level. The problem for a number of women who are captured in these large sweeps is that their involvement very frequently is minor. Sometimes it is a direct result of the coercion, control, and abuse by a far more deeply involved partner or ex-partner. Because frequently women in that circumstance have nothing to trade in order to get a lower sentence, they are sometimes sentenced at with a higher sentence than are those men who have greater involvement. You see that a larger percentage of women in prison are convicted for drug offenses than men, and this represents one of the significant reasons for this dramatic increase in the number of women in prison. In addition, law very frequently fails to provide for the coercion, either in sentencing or in the guilt phase of prosecution, that is a direct result of abuse. I would recommend, if you haven't seen it, this DOJ report from the Office of Violence Against Women on the impact of incarceration that I cite here on slide 12. We also see victimization direct result in incarceration in the ways in which young women, juvenile girls, enter into the criminal justice system. Research not cited on this slide finds that girls are much more likely to be cited for status offenses because of their perceived sexual misconduct than are boys. This report that comes again from the OVW, the Impact of Incarceration report, notes the number of young women who enter the criminal justice system because they are fleeing abusive homes or abusive foster homes, and find that in order to support themselves, they frequently are become involved as sex workers and sometimes become involved in drug use. This is obviously not peculiar. This is not a peculiar entry to the criminal justice system for juvenile girls. It's also true for adult women as well. So we'll talk more later about the impact of mass incarceration or hyper-incarceration on entire communities. But let me just note here that one of the impacts of the kind of concentrated incarceration in communities is that the risk of contacting the police for instances of abuse becomes far more significant. When you have significant numbers of individuals who are on parole or probation, then the risk from contact with the police is very significant, both for the individual who is on probation or parole or for the individual who's concerned about their loved one who is. It's important to remember that police searches of homes by someone who's on probation or parole don't require a search warrant. You don't get the same kinds of Fourth Amendment protections if you're on probation or parole. They can search at will. And by the way, similarly, if you're receiving TANF, if you're receiving welfare, then you have diminished Fourth Amendment protections as well. So when you are in a neighborhood, in a community in which there are numbers of people who are subject to that kind of search and who can be violated for parole or probation on a very low standard of proof, then it certainly has an impact on whether you call the police. I'm going to talk more about those connections, those neighborhood connections, in a moment. So now I want to talk about 3 additional harms. So we've talked about the victimization connection, but 3 additional harms that likely increase the risk for male perpetrated domestic violence against women. I put it that way because that's what the research supports, not that I don't recognize other scenarios of domestic violence, but that's the research that I'm going to be relying on. So the first of these is what I call the economic connection. And it goes this way. Hyper-incarceration of the kind I've described deepens poverty, it deepens unemployment, and creates economic strain. Other research finds that poverty, male unemployment, and economic strain are all strongly correlated with significant increases in male-on-female domestic violence. Mass incarceration decreases the economic well-being of individuals who are incarcerated as well as their families. So a conviction can have devastating economic consequences. Some of those are direct. There are, across the country, states have adopted laws that deny occupational licensing for everything from a barber to, as I put here, a scrap metal processor. In addition, a number of states have chosen to make individuals who've been incarcerated, ineligible for welfare, ineligible for food stamps. They're barred from public housing. And of course, a number of states like my state of Florida, they can't vote, which decreases the political power of entire communities. In addition, child support debt is not told while in prison. So a number of people leave prison with a significant amount of child support debt, which of course one cannot discharge in bankruptcy either. But it's not only these collateral consequences of having been having a conviction. It's that convictions are incredibly costly. The states have addressed financial shortfalls by shifting the cost of court operations onto the backs of poor people through the criminal justice system. So you see here just some examples: application fees to even apply for, or to obtain rather, a public defender, the reliance on fines and fees. Very frequently courts require, for example, anyone sent to a treatment program to pay for the treatment program, and then if they fail to pay in some jurisdictions, that can be a means of ratcheting up their court cost. You see prison fees, you see probation fees, all across the board, so that the cost both to the individual and to the family members who try to help them meet these obligations is very significant. You also see the criminalization of what really ought to be civil kinds of penalties. If you look at the Ferguson report that the Department of Justice did, it provides a very, very good example of just such a thing. The city was using civil fines for failure to cut the grass, for example, for failure to clean up your yard, for example, to bankroll the city, and sent the police out with orders for how many people they needed to charge. And then those people who failed to pay those civil fines found the fines ratcheting up and up until eventually a bench warrant was issued, and it became really a criminal matter. And then, of course, most of us know this, you have the really dramatic consequences on the ability to get a job for those who have a prison record. So that incarceration has devastating consequences for employment. One of the consequences of these, in addition, there are economic consequences that, to incarceration that extend beyond those that are true for the person who is incarcerated. In other words, there are economic consequences that affect entire families. Most imprisoned fathers, for example, were primary wage earners before they were incarcerated. So when fathers are incarcerated, about 80% of the children who have a father incarcerated live with their mother. These children have much higher rates of homelessness and other financial stress. The economic consequence of the primary wage earner being incarcerated has devastating effects on the mother who's left behind with children. By the way, when women are incarcerated, they're much more likely to lose their children to the state. Women are much more likely to have been the primary caregiver. Children are less likely to live with their father when the mother's incarcerated, and they end up in foster care. So now, again, what do these economic consequences have to do with the risk for domestic violence? Quite a bit, I think. Poor women suffer significantly higher rates of domestic violence. Study after study finds this connection. I provide one source here from the National Crime Victimization Survey, and of course, the National Crime Victimization Survey relies on a random sample data. It does not rely on reported incidents of crime. But what they find here is that household incomes of less than $7,500 suffer nearly 7 times higher rates of domestic violence than at the high end households that are making annual incomes of $75,000 or more. But you find similar kinds of connections even when you look not at just the low end compared to the high end, but rather at sort of step progressions. So I don't know if you can see this chart well, but my point here is really described in the paragraph at the top, and that is that violence rates for those that are living at or below the federal poverty level are 2 times those 2 times that of those who live at just the next rung, and that's the 101% to 200% of the federal poverty level. So you see this kind of stepwise relationship between poverty and risk for experiencing domestic violence. In addition to that, you see research looking at the effect of male unemployment and unstable employment on the rates of male on female domestic violence. So Michael Benson and Greer Fox, for example, did a longitudinal study of heterosexual couples. And what they found was that men who experienced one episode of unemployment had much higher rates, 7.5, 7.5%, compared to those who remained steadily employed over the 6-year study. You also see connection between financial strain, subjective measures of financial strain, and domestic violence incident rates. So they measured subjective measures by asking people questions about whether they were worried about their finances. So you have both objective measures in terms of unemployment and as well as subjective measures, both of which are finding a very strong relationship with increased risk for domestic violence. So we've looked at the impact of the victimization connection, the impact of the economic connection. If in fact mass incarceration has such devastating economic effects, then one would be concerned that it would have not only devastating economic effects on family members who have a parent who's incarcerated, but also that you would be concerned about the reentry effects in terms of the risk, the increased risk for domestic violence as a result of the economic effects of having been incarcerated. All right, so now I want to talk about the neighborhood connection. So for this, I want to slow it down a little bit because I think that this is complicated, and the research here is both more complicated and more uncertain. But the concentrated police surveillance and hyper-incarceration has effects that extend throughout the entire neighborhood. Remember, we talked about the way, or I talked about the ways in which incarceration is concentrated in particular geographic locales and in particular communities, often urban poor communities of color. These are communities that have already experienced devastating effects of the changes in employment and job availability and the diminishment of social service kinds of supports. So already are experiencing a number of economic problems. And then the concern here is that hyper-incarceration actually exaggerates and deepens those concerns. So when you remove people who are at their prime wage, significant numbers of people who are at their prime wage earning years and their prime child rearing years, you have effects on the whole community. So one effect is obvious. There's less income generated in the entire neighborhood. But another effect is that very frequently people leaving prison return to the neighborhoods from which they came. Sometimes that's a requirement actually of parole or probation. Sometimes it has more to do with family ties, perhaps children who live in that neighborhood. The more ex-felons you have in a particular neighborhood, the more difficult it is, the more economic effects for the entire neighborhood. You have ex-felons who find it very difficult to find work, and that in turn renders the economic viability of the whole neighborhood weaker. You also have these very perverse kinds of outcomes in that once you have a concentration of ex-felons in a particular neighborhood, it may have, it sometimes has a ratcheting effect on further incarceration. Why is that? Because a significant number of ex-felons in a neighborhood invites closer scrutiny by law enforcement, and particularly when you're talking about drug crimes, then it really is about where you shine the light. In other words, there are drug crimes, particularly low-level possession, are so common and so frequent across our culture that if you shine the light in a college dorm room, you'll find it there. If you shine the light in a street corner with a concentration of ex-felons, you'll find it there. And remember, too, what I've already described, and that is the ways in which someone on probation and parole can be violated very easily on a very low level of proof, and even by engaging in behavior that's not itself criminal. For example, being with someone who is an ex-felon. So you have this kind of double down on police surveillance and concentration that is in part a product of the very fact that you have so many ex-felons in the neighborhood. So in addition to that, then researchers find that the effect of this kind of hyper-surveillance and hyper-incarceration is a diminishment in the social controls in the neighborhood and a fraying of the social networks that might provide measures of protection, for example, from domestic violence. So again, the geography of incarceration is concentrated, contingent on race and poverty, as I've already mentioned. And as Dorothy Roberts describes, this kind of fraying of social controls and networks on which people rely, and particularly poor women rely in order to raise children and in order to be economically viable. The more people you pull out of extended networks, the more frayed those networks are, the more vulnerable the women are. So you have this impact of mass incarceration in fraying social networks, in decreasing social controls, in decreasing the ability to rely on others in the neighborhood to offer protection, to act as a brake on abusive behavior. What we find quite separate from this research on the impact of mass incarceration is another body of research that looks at neighborhoods that are described sometimes as disadvantaged, sometimes as highly disadvantaged, sometimes as multiply disadvantaged. We might think of as multiply oppressed. That the research to which I refer looks at neighborhoods that meet the criteria for highly disadvantaged and looks at their rates of domestic violence, finding a very significant relationship between living in those neighborhoods and male on female domestic violence. So I quote two research studies on this effect here. The first one is Benson and Fox. They're the same people that did the, indeed it's the same research project that did the the unemployment data that I referred to earlier. And what they find here is that the rate of male on female domestic violence was 2 times higher for couples who lived in disadvantaged neighborhoods as compared to couples who lived in advantaged. The research by Van Wyck and Benson and Fox and Damaris at the bottom looks not just at advantaged, disadvantaged, but actually at a 3-step, highly advantaged, disadvantaged, moderate, and advantaged, again finding a very significant relationship between living in a highly disadvantaged neighborhood and rates of domestic violence. So you might think that this is hardly surprising. After all, we've already looked at the relationship between poverty and domestic violence. So if you have a neighborhood in which you have a high poverty rate, of course you would expect to see a higher rate. But actually what this research does is to control for other factors that research shows to be related to increases in domestic violence, and finds that living in the neighborhood seems to have an effect quite apart from just the makeup of the neighborhood. In other words, a way to put this more concretely is that individuals who live in these neighborhoods are at a higher risk for domestic violence than are people who make the same income as they do but live in a more advantaged neighborhood. So thus far then, we've looked at the victimization connection, the impact of mass incarceration on women, particularly poor African American women. We've looked at the connection with economic stability of formerly incarcerated individuals, the impact on their families, and the likely impact of domestic violence or the risk for domestic violence. And now we've looked at the neighborhood effects when large numbers of people are under control of the criminal justice system or are formerly incarcerated. It has a dampening effect on the entire neighborhood, on the economics of the entire neighborhood. When so many people are removed from a neighborhood, it has the effect of decreasing social control and fraying networks. That very circumstance is correlated with increased risk for domestic violence. So the final connection I want to look at is the trauma and mental health connection. Prisons and jails expose people to traumatic events at a very high rate. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics finds that 10% of prisoners report sexual victimization in prison, 10 to 20 report physical abuse, and the threat of harm creates hypervigilance and anxiety in very significant numbers of people in prison. The number of men in prison who are diagnosed with PTSD is much, much higher than the general population. And of course we know that PTSD is strongly correlated with increased risk for the perpetration of domestic violence. Our political choice to use prison rather than treatment for drug offenses also increases the likelihood of individuals leaving prison with substance abuse problems, which also are correlated with increases in domestic violence. So I want to step back then from these four connections, and I want to talk a little bit about the bigger picture. One might call this the politics of mass incarceration, but a bigger picture. I mentioned at the beginning that Beth Richie describes our current moment as prison nation, and part of what Richie is talking about is the way in which punitive, controlling, harsh responses have become the norm, and the way in which the criminal justice system and harsh kinds of state penalties have become means of controlling people of color, but poor people of color, and also based on discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and sexual identity and immigration status. So as Dorothy Roberts describes, the state apparatus of welfare, prison, foster care, and deportation, immigration, have all become extremely punitive mechanisms for regulating people. And Dorothy's point is that at the same time in which very significant resources have been removed from communities, so that what little safety net we had has been completely frayed and completely emptied. The criminal justice, resources have been pumped into the criminal justice system, and the criminal justice system and other forms of punitive kinds of responses have become the norm. I refer to this as I'm sorry, I'm going to skip over here and I'll come back to that. Jonathan Simon talks about this in terms of governing through crime. And what Simon means is that crime has become the principal way in which we not only address social problems, but even understand social problems. In other words, we think in terms of crime or crime-like remedies for every kind of social injustice, and I think even in terms of how to understand equality. Another way to think about this is the demands that we make on the state are focused on safety through a criminal justice lens rather than focusing on the kinds of needs that human beings have, such as housing, economic sustenance, etc. Now I'm going to come back to what I call crime logic. By crime logic, I'm talking about what I see as a controlling kind of narrative, and I think we see this a lot in the way in which the public thinks about domestic violence and thinks about sexual assault. And we certainly see it in the national discourse about sexual assault on campus, for example. What do I mean by crime logic? Crime logic is a focus on individual culpability rather than collective accountability, and it's a disdain for attention to social determinants of behavior. It sets up a paradox in which you cannot both be responsible for your behavior and at the same time have the culture recognize the social determinants of that behavior and set out to change those. And I can talk more about that in question and answers if that's not clear. So let me shift now about what is this connection between hyper-incarceration and domestic violence? What does this mean for our work, in my view? So I think one thing it means is that we need to be allies in the work against mass incarceration and biased policing. Deborah Wiseman, who has been doing domestic violence work for a long time and teaches at UNC Law School, highlights as an example the absence of advocates for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault at the table when the New York City meetings that came out of the litigation around stop and frisk. So what happened in New York is all of the various organizations that had been mobilizing against stop and frisk in New York then were engaged with the city in coming up with remedies. And domestic violence wasn't represented. We weren't at the table, and yet the way in which the police respond on the street is, of course, central to what we do. So I think by shifting the lens, by recognizing both our connection to these issues and also making connections with the organizations that are involved in opposing mass incarceration, it puts us down at the table, and I think that is critically important. Indeed, police bias is a substantial problem for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. The responses from the field survey that was published by the ACLU a couple of years ago reports on responses from advocates and attorneys for survivors. We had more than 900 responses, and we found very significant bias against immigrants, women in general, against gay, lesbian, bi, and transgender individuals, and against poor people in general, against African Americans across the board. The bias policing that is the object of organizations like Black Lives Matter is very much central to our issues as well. We also, not on this slide, but we also found that police tend to disbelieve claims by women when they identify claims, of sexual assault or domestic violence, when they believe that those women are sex workers or drug addicted. So a very significant bias against women who are perceived to be lawbreakers, and most of that law breaking that came out in the survey had to do with sex work and drug addiction. Indeed, one respondent said that when police responded to a rape claim by the sex workers with whom she worked, the police would often run a warrant search on the victim. So the other kind of thing we can do then is to join the work against mass incarceration and racially biased policing. And I offer just one example here. I think it's a modest example in some ways, and yet I think terribly important. Some of you may know of Genesee. It's a domestic violence program in Los Angeles that's been around for a very, very long time. They have a legal clinic, and part of the work they do is to help people benefit from Prop 47. Prop 47 rolled back prison sentences, and if you were sentenced under the old regime, you might have an opportunity to change what was a felony into a misdemeanor, and of course that makes a huge difference in the collateral consequences. Genesee took this on. They decided that was one of the projects that they should be working on, and they explained to their stakeholders and to their supporters why it was that the effects of mass incarceration were issues for the work they did. I've seen other examples. If you were a part of the webinar that Kelly Miller and Jennifer Martinez did from the Idaho Coalition, here in Florida and Miami, the Miami Workers Center is working on what they're calling a FEM agenda, which puts domestic violence in the context both of police brutality, but also claims for living wage and immigration reform. Which leads me to the next suggestion, and that is to focus our reform efforts on challenging structural inequalities rather than focusing so much energy on criminal justice reform. And then to think, I think, critically about how we do, how we work with the police, how we think about criminal justice reform more broadly. So the again, the survey that I mentioned before, published by the ACLU, we found that 63% of the respondents were aware of and found useful regular meetings between domestic violence and sexual assault service providers and advocates and police and prosecutors. So 63%, that's a very significant level of awareness. But only 28% even knew if there were other mechanisms of police oversight in their community. And I want to underscore, the question wasn't, are you involved with other methods, but rather, do you know if they exist, and only 28% did. So I think one of the questions here is to look at, in a critical kind of way, whether the continuing to place all of our eggs for police reform in these kinds of regular meetings with police representatives in our various councils is as effective as we might be were we instead to ally with organizations that are putting pressure on police from outside to make changes. So the Department of Justice in the Obama administration offered an alternative method of controlling or responding to police gender violence. To gender bias in policing. I'm not inclined to spend much time on this because I think every indication from Attorney General Sessions is that the current DOJ will pull back from these efforts. But I'm happy to talk about that in questions and answers if people want. And then I think working with incarcerated women and men is an important piece of the work we do. I think that requires us to recognize the ways in which experiencing violence relates to the perpetration of violence, and to make that connection for the public. And finally, I would encourage us to investigate alternatives. And by alternatives, I mean I'm thinking about restorative justice and transformative justice and other alternatives that are less punitive, that are less carceral. The Violence Against Women Office in the Obama administration made a number of moves in this direction. So for example, there are 2 restorative justice projects that are funded by the Violence Against Women Office. One of them is underway right now to gather information about the use of restorative justice in domestic violence cases. Another is out right now. I don't think they've awarded it yet, but it's a demonstration project to use restorative justice for campus sexual assault. In addition, the Violence Against Women Office funded a roundtable on the use of restorative justice. And I think you're going to have some webinars that talk more about restorative justice, but I'm also happy to talk about that in questions and answers. So in conclusion, I think anti-domestic violence activists and service providers have a unique opportunity to make the connection for the public and for policymakers between the devastating violence of mass incarceration and the interpersonal violence that we work so hard to respond to and prevent. The time to act is now, and I look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Donna. Wow, that was a lot to digest, and I've heard a lot of it before, so thank you so much. We had a couple questions. One of them was from Tanya, and her question is, what is your definition of advantage versus disadvantaged neighborhood? So going back to that, was it lack of resources and income? And she said she apologizes if you actually went over it, but I think it would be helpful to revisit it. She said
Sure.
Your point around having similar incomes but living in advantage versus / disadvantaged neighborhoods prompted her question.
Yes, I understand. I'm going to go back up to that slide so we can look at, here we go. No, I think that's a really good question. So the way in which the researchers define this, is they took census tract data, and they're looking for what they call concentrated disadvantage, and it's defined in this way: the percentage of households that are single parent. It's a combination: percentage single parent, percentage that are non-white, percentage that are unemployed, percentage of families on public assistance, percentage below the poverty line. So the reason for those criteria and the interaction between those criteria is that those criteria have provided the definition through a whole series of studies that have looked at neighborhood, sometimes called disorganization in the sociology research. And so that's been the unit of measure. Does that answer the question?
Tanya, maybe you can write in if that answered the question. The other thing I just wanted to follow up is, I think I talked to you about the very first time I heard you talk about this stuff, and I just have always felt discomfort about the language here, and feeling like that the language also, I mean, you're talking about communities where a lot of them are communities of color, and I feel like the language gets used as a proxy for communities of color. And, I just think I need help, and others may need help, on figuring out ways of talking about these realities in ways that don't sound like it's blaming people within those communities. I mean, I think you did that, but I realize that some of the language actually makes me anxious.
Well, I appreciate that, and some of the language makes me anxious. I think that the my point is the outcomes, and here's the problem, I think, and I think it's not just here, but it's across the board. The problem is that we find it so difficult in our culture to talk about the importance of structural inequality. We want to think in terms of individual responsibility. We don't want to think in terms of the ways in which racist structures impact people and harm people. And I think that this is one of the critical moves for the domestic violence movement to make, is to name the structures that are impacting people in the communities that they serve. So I think we see this really clearly, and I think we've done a pretty good job of identifying, for example, the way in which the immigration policies impact entire communities, put significant numbers of people at risk, discourage people from participating in civic life or from even calling the police for an emergency circumstance, right? So we articulate the way that all of that happens, and that doesn't diminish the responsibility of an individual who chooses to hit someone, but we recognize that the social context in which that happens has some part to play. And if what we want to do is to change that circumstance, then we need to be attacking those structural inequalities. We need to be saying, in this case, that the immigration policies are bad. They're bad for everybody. And one of the ways in which they're bad is it makes it more difficult to escape domestic violence and probably increases the risk for domestic violence and the occurrence of domestic violence. And we need to be doing that in a very strong way. I think we don't hold the state accountable. We don't look at the ways in which state choices, our choices theoretically, but state choices about where we put money and how we respond to how we define criminal offending and how we respond to it increases domestic violence, increases the risk for domestic violence, and makes it hard to escape. And so we have to have a way of talking about those structural inequalities. And perhaps we don't want to use the sociology language. It has its pluses and minuses. But we have to have a way to do that.
So before we move to some of the other questions, Judy had a question about the neighborhood effect. And she asked, have you seen any positive impact of violence against women programs shifting to having stronger neighborhood presence, community connection, and work with whole families?
That's such a great question, and I don't have the research. I have not seen research on that. I think that that's such an important question. And if that research exists, I haven't seen it. But I think it's an area that needs more research.
And Judy, if you all in Washington State actually have some of the information, could you let us know? We'd really appreciate it. So thank you. So Donna,
Yeah, I would love to see that.
You know, I guess you're not surprised that some of these questions that are coming up, I'm sort of surprised they didn't come up earlier, which is, you know, certainly our jails and prisons are not filled with people convicted of DV-related charges. And so, you know, so many communities are just struggling to get the police to arrest batterers and to do anything when they get to the scene and to get prosecutors to prosecute. And so this is sort of, you know, a couple of the questions come up here. So what do we do when the community response to domestic violence has historically been so lenient?
Right. Well, I think there I think there are two things. One, actually, I'm not sure that the first part of what you said is correct. Getting some data on the percentage of people in jail as opposed to prison for domestic violence is something I'm trying to do right now, but I would say that there's certainly some anecdotal evidence from some jurisdictions that a very high number of people in jail are there for domestic violence. But even so, right, the question about how you get police to respond, I think, is a very important and serious question. I think it's first important to recognize that in my view, these things are not oppositional. The failure of police to respond is very frequently not best described as hostility to the claims of domestic violence, though there is some of that, but rather hostility to particular people in particular neighborhoods. So if you look, for example, Mimi Kim is going to be doing a webinar soon, and Mimi has done some research looking at the history of response in California. The very early case brought by Eva Patterson and other famous civil rights lawyers against the city of Oakland for their failure to respond to domestic violence cases was understood as a gender discrimination issue, and it was litigated that way because that's what the law best provided for. But in fact, the facts on the ground were that the police were not responding primarily to African American women. And that's why I put this slide back on the board. The failure to respond to victims who are perceived as unworthy is, I think, just simply the other side of the coin of police bias that results in police brutality and in police misconduct. I don't think these things are opposed. And I think if that's true, once you begin to see that that's the connection, then you can begin to work with those organizations that are concerned not about police response, both in terms of mass incarceration, police brutality, and bias against particular victims. And there are organizations that are doing just that kind of linkage, that coming out of the effort in California on Prop 47. I'm trying to remember the name of this organization. I think it's, I've forgotten it now, but I can certainly post it. They're drawing attention both to the failure of police to respond appropriately to victims, particularly low-income victims of color, as well as victims that are, as I mentioned, that are treated as unworthy, both in terms of class or because of sexual identity, sexual orientation. And at the same time to recognize that locking people up for years and years and years in draconian sentences doesn't really do anything for victims. So I think that's a piece of it. And then third, I think that there's a political question about there's a political question and there's a strategy question, and that is, do you get the most change in your neighborhood by continuing to work with police departments and prosecutors in the kind of regular coalition meetings that are taking place all over the country? Has that been really, really effective? And are you finding that the women who are at most risk for criminalization are protected? Is that working? Or is it not working and it's 3 steps forward and 2 steps back? And are there other opportunities for coalition building that might have a stronger effect? Opportunities for working with, whether it's a civilian complaint review board or whether it's local grassroots organizations or whether it's Black Lives Matter or whatever. So I think there's a question there that's both politics and it's an efficacy and strategy combined. And fourth, I guess, if I'm counting, or 5, I think that I can be misheard as suggesting that an individual should never call the police, and that is not what I'm saying. What I'm addressing is the movement and where we put our energy and who we ally with and how we can make a difference.
Thank you. It's really helpful because I think this is where people really struggle a lot, and kind of following up on this theme. I mean, I think you did an excellent job on outlining the horrible consequences of direct and collateral consequences of being incarcerated and being convicted or incarcerated, and how bad those consequences are. And it's kind of interesting now where there seems to be increased understanding of that reality by a lot of people in both our field and also in state and federal legislatures. But then it's like, so are you saying that because the consequences are so bad that people shouldn't be sent to prison?
You mean ever? Under all circumstances, I think prison is pretty horrible for anybody. I think that there may be circumstances where you need to incapacitate someone because of the harms that you cannot prevent to other people. So I'm not a firm prison abolitionist, if that's the question, right? But we are so far from that standard. In other words, most of the people, by a huge margin, that we currently incarcerate for very lengthy periods of time are not at risk to anybody. And a significant number of those people who are at risk could be, we could address those risks in ways that would not involve lengthy incarceration. And 3, for those people who are incarcerated, they are incarcerated for the most part in tremendously inhumane conditions that violate international law, as well documented and well reported, and we could change those conditions dramatically. But let me just say something here. I think that it's really important to not, in my view, it's part of this kind of milieu in which we live, this air in which we breathe, that we focus on the criminal justice system instead of saying, well, let's presume that we need prison, right? It's not do we need it, do we not, but rather what are all the social conditions that we want to attack, that we want to change to diminish the whatever is the residual need, right? So if we were, for example, to take a page from what some other countries have done and to address drug use with rehabilitation, I imagine most of us would think that's the way to go. We would say, let's address drug use with rehabilitation rather than incarceration. Incarceration very frequently doesn't include rehabilitation. It doesn't include treatment. It's not a particularly effective way of providing treatment, and whatever positive effects might occur within the first 2 years, after which it's just years and years of just nothing but harm, right? And so really one of the things I think we need to do, and we are uniquely able to do this because we see it so much, is to be the loudest voice for changing those structural conditions, for recognizing how critical, for example, economic supports are to everything that we care about. Whether that's increases in TANF and that's changes in education and so forth. I mean, one of the most shocking things, right? It seems to me that is a collateral consequence of mass incarceration is the inability to get a college loan, and then you have a number of colleges that, in addition to that, screen and don't admit students who have a criminal record. Did that answer
Donna,
your question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pushing you hard on this stuff because this is the set of questions we keep getting, and I think this stuff makes people nervous, and so I'm really pushing you to help us all be able to better articulate some of our positions. And when people start getting nervous, it's like, oh my God, are you saying never arrest anybody and we can't get anybody arrested in our community? I think what you just said was very helpful. I hope that was true for others on the webinar. And just talking about sort of coming up with some rationale about choices people are making. Do you happen to know how the Genesee program described why they were doing what they are now to help people with felony records and traffic ticket amnesty to their constituents? And do you know if it's a hard sell?
I think Allison Messenger may be on with us. If she is, she should type in.
Okay.
Because she's the attorney at Genesee that did this. So I'll tell you what I heard from her. But if she's there, she should pipe in.
Okay.
So they described to their constituent, there was pushback, as I understand it. People said, what does this have to do with domestic violence? And perhaps even, I'm not sure, but I think even, why are we helping felons, right? And so her response, or their response, was that this is directly connected to the work we do. It makes it makes women who have records more vulnerable to domestic violence. It increases the economic cost of having been formerly incarcerated, or it decrease by engaging in this, you're going to decrease the economic cost because you move somebody from being an ex-felon to a misdemeanor, and that makes a whole bunch of difference in terms of job prospects, et cetera, voting, et cetera. Well, not voting in California, but voting in Florida. And that has a relationship to the likelihood of perpetrating domestic violence. So I'm going to my public chat here, Sue, and seeing if she's there.
I didn't see her weigh in, so I'm not sure if she's there or not.
She may not.
Maybe she's shy and doesn't want to.
She may not.
Or otherwise,
why are you calling me out?
But
I think. Let me just say. Let me talk about Genesee for a moment. So what I think is encouraging to me about their project is that you have the presentation, the last webinar with Kelly and is it Jennifer, I think?
That's
and
correct.
They're talking about. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. That is correct, Jennifer.
Yeah, Jennifer, and they're talking about a really thoroughgoing reorientation of the work they do, and that's very, very exciting. And I should say that Genesee, for a very long time, has been working with primarily with women of color, and had racial justice as a central part of what they did. So perhaps they were differently situated. I don't know enough about the history with Idaho, so I just know what that seminar provided. But on the other hand, Genesee didn't make a radical change in the services they did, or even in their in how they worked with the criminal justice system. What they did was to say, this issue of mass incarceration is really important, and it does have a relationship with our work, and for that reason, we're going to be involved in doing this work, this Prop 47 and traffic ticket amnesty kind of work, because it in fact impacts the community in which we work. And so I think there are a number of ways, I say that because I think there are a number of ways in which organizations can get involved in opposing mass incarceration. And I think that there's a whole suddenly the word left my brain. There's a whole continuum, that's the word. There's a whole continuum of ways to do that. So I present at the end what I think are some things that organizations might want to think about, but I think that there are just multiple ways to think about it, to think about how to integrate that information and the importance of that information in what you do.
Donna, did you see that Allison did weigh in? I don't know if you want to take a look at that and share that, or just people can take a look at that.
Okay.
So thank you, Allison, very much. I mean, that's wanting to address some of the root causes of DV and other forms of violence. I guess, Allison, my question is, were you working only with victims of domestic violence who had felony charges, or were you working with other people in the community who had felony charges? So if you could let us know, or Donna, maybe you know the answer to that.
My understanding is that they were working.
Donna? Oh goodness, I think we lost Donna. I wonder if her phone just died. And thank you, Allison, for answering that. We're going to see if Donna's going to call back in. I hope she does. I'm sorry about that. I just wonder if her battery just died, if she was on a cell phone. We are nearing the end of this. I know I was not able to get to all the questions. We will collect these, obviously, have been collecting these, and get them to Donna and see if we can come back and talk about some of these questions later.
Sue.
Hi, Donna.
Hi, I got kicked off. I'm so sorry.
Okay, you're back.
But I don't know if Allison responded, but my understanding is that they worked with several other legal clinics, and they were assisting anybody who came in the door.
Yeah. That's
so no, it wasn't just. Yeah, we worked with both. She says that now.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it wasn't directed. I mean, I think one of the one of my concerns is that I think for reasons that are really that were strategic and responded to the politics in which we found ourselves for the last 30 years, we've carved out exceptions as best we could for survivors. So you could think about, with welfare reform, we tried to carve out an exception for domestic violence victims. And you could think about a whole host of other kinds of punitive responses that we've seen in this wave of punitiveness that's been true for about 20 plus years, that we've tried to do that. And I think, I understand why we did that, right? Because in the politics of anti-poor, and in the politics of anti-immigration and anti-immigrants, and in the politics of overwhelming punitiveness, you try to do what you can. But I think one of the costs of doing that is that it means that we have focused less, or we're less recognized as a voice for for representing the impact of those negative policies on everybody, not just someone who is identified as a survivor. And by recognizing the ways in which punitive policies and the emptying out of what little social safety net we ever had, the complete shredding of social safety net, increases the risk for domestic violence, increases the, creates harms across the board and increases the risk for domestic violence, then we can be in a position to be in coalition with other organizations that have that message, and we can articulate why it matters in terms of domestic violence. I mean, there's such an irony in that, on the one hand, passing the Violence Against Women Act in the same era in which welfare reform was passed, as an example. I can say more on that, but perhaps I'll stop and take a question.
Well, we have 4 minutes left, and we have about 7 questions. But one of the things you said during your presentation is that you would come back and talk a little bit about restorative justice in the context of domestic violence and sexual assault cases. And is that
Sure.
just too big a can of worms to open up in the last 4 minutes?
I'll tell you what. Am I right, Sue, that don't you have somebody who's going to talk about RJ? Am I wrong about that?
Not scheduled.
Ah, okay. All right.
Well, but we hope to.
Okay, good. Well, I'm happy to. I think that I think that there's coming from a growing concern that a focus on punitive kinds of responses and what I would call crime-centered responses hasn't served victims very well and has created harms both for survivors and as well as for people who perpetrate harm. Has been a growing interest in restorative justice, and I don't think that it's a panacea at all. I think that we should approach restorative justice cautiously. But I have, and some of you may know that I did some research, you probably don't know, that I did some research some years ago looking at Navajo Nation peacemaking and the use of peacemaking in domestic violence cases. So I do think that restorative justice can be one of several ways of responding to domestic violence. I don't think that it's going to be the appropriate response in every case, but I think it's going to be appropriate in some. I suppose in the short time I have, the most important thing to get across would be that it is fundamental to restorative justice programs of the kind that I'm aware of and that are tailored to respond to domestic violence and sexual assault, that one, the survivor may knowingly, with full information, decides that she or he wants to do this, and two, that the person who perpetrated the harm takes responsibility for having done so and admits to that before entering into the program. And those are two fundamental requirements that I think all of the people who are engaged in restorative justice would agree are absolutely central. There are restorative justice programs now, both in the U.S. and even more so in some other countries, that are addressing some sexual assault and domestic violence cases. And I think I have 1 minute, but I'm happy to send people information about that. There are a whole bunch of resources that I can send. And as I mentioned, there's a program right now, or project rather, funded by the Office of Violence Against Women that's gathering information about restorative justice programs in domestic violence cases as we speak. They're doing a national collection of such information. So that will come out soon, and that's something that you could share as well.
Yeah, we can collect that information, Donna, and make set up a link and send it out to people.
Sure.
And we weren't able to get to everybody's questions, and Donna, maybe we can talk to figure out if there's some ways of addressing a few of them that we weren't able to address during this webinar. And as always, I just really want to say that what you share is so important, and it's just so valuable, and I really want to thank you for your just amazing work, but also for sharing it with us today. And I hope this will be the beginning of many conversations with many of you who were on today who I don't necessarily know if you've been on some of our other webinars in the past. So I hope that this community of people who are trying to struggle through this stuff continues to grow. So Donna, any final parting words?
I would just say that it's just really such a privilege to have this conversation, and I so much appreciate the work that the people on this call do, and that they would take time from that busy work to be a part of this conversation. Thank you very much.
And thank you. And thanks to everybody who's participated today. We will follow up, and you'll get a little evaluation, and if you could really take that minute and a half to fill it out, it'd be really helpful. So Donna, thank you so much, and Dot, thanks for your help, and see you next time. We will include information about upcoming webinars when we send out your follow-up message, so please take a look at that. Thank you. Thank you, Donna.
Oh,
bye-bye.
My pleasure. Bye.